My name's Jesse Carter. I'm with DSHS Planning, and we're excited to have Murray Pinner here. This is part of a joint call. We've started a monthly series of Achieving Together conversation series around our Ending the Epidemic plan in the state of Texas. So different parts of the plan to talk about, and we're continuing to work on scheduling those things. And then also this is being hosted, we have under the Texas HIV Syndicate and Achieving Together, we have a series of population affinity groups that meet monthly. We have a Black gay men's group, the Latinx gay men's group, white gay men's group, Black women's group, and the transgender women's group. This is being hosted by the white gay men's affinity group as well. So thanks everyone for joining us. If you're interested in any of those things, you can learn more about that on the Achieving Together website at achievingtogethertx.org. So with that, we'll get started with the call. Thank you for everyone joining us. We've got Murray Pinner with the Prevention Access Campaign. He'll be talking a little bit about some of the science around treatment as prevention, a little bit of an update, but mainly talking about how different messages can be used around treatment as prevention to reach different communities, and how we need to tailor and understand community in order to use those messages effectively, and both educating about the need to maximize health outcomes through viral suppression, but also around treatment as prevention, and how helping folks and supporting people as they become virally suppressed can help reduce HIV in our communities. So with that, I'm going to go ahead. We're going to just some housekeeping. We will mute everyone. Murray will take questions after his presentation. So if you have questions, you can jot them down. And then we'll have some discussion after the presentation. You can also type your questions into the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat as we go along as well. And then when we do questions and answer, you'll have the opportunity to either ask questions through the chat or unmute yourself as we go along. With that, I will turn it over to Murray. Thanks, Murray.
Right. Thank you, Jesse. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up for those of you that can see. Yes, yes, yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, super. I am going to move to share my screen here. Hopefully this will work okay. And let's see. Well, there. Can folks see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's great, Murray.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really excited to be back in Texas without being back in Texas, but this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I don't know how many of you know, but I worked in the Fort Worth area. Gosh, it's been close to 20 years ago now, so I don't really want to date myself, but it has been a few years since I've been there. So Texas was home to me for some time, and really got my start in HIV work in Texas. And so it is great to be back presenting to you all. I'm with the Prevention Access Campaign. We are the organization that started the U=U movement back in 2016. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we didn't know about U=U and why we decided to create the movement. We worked with community, we worked with researchers, public health officials, and influential institutions to build a consensus on U=U and to ensure that the life-changing information reaches the people that it is intended to benefit. So throughout my presentation today, I'm going to focus on opportunities to reduce stigma, and I really want to hear from you all about what those opportunities might be and what challenges you might see with incorporating this message into our broader work. I'd ask you to think about a few things along the way as we're going through these slides. Think about how the message can work to empower people living with HIV, how it does, as Jesse said, encourage uptake of treatment, and how it can work to reduce stigma. Obviously, the message is powerful, and I'll get into what it means, but the message is powerful in that it encourages uptake of treatment and encourages people to achieve an undetectable status, which we know prevents new infections, but it also has the extremely strong power to reduce stigma. And so it's really a message that we believe is an important part of ending the epidemic, and one that I'm excited to share with you about. Be thinking along the way about a couple of questions. How can the message help reduce stigma? What obstacles or challenges you might see in implementing it and or the uptake of the message? And how do we use the message to motivate people who are not either testing and or, if they're HIV positive, are not either engaged in care and or taking medication? So it's really about motivating. The other thing I want to say up front is that when we created this message, we did not create it, we did not copyright it, we did not create it with keeping in mind that it has to be used as U equals U. The message can be adapted. The important thing is that the message is conveyed to people, that it's conveyed accurately, that it is conveyed consistently and very boldly and strongly, because the science is really powerful in this area, and I will go through that as well. So with that outline for today, the things I want to touch on: what is U equals U? Obviously, some background on the science, a little bit of history about the U equals U campaign, and examples of other campaigns that are taking place across the world. We want to talk just a little bit about how to communicate U equals U. There's what we recommend, some very important parts of the messaging to make sure that it's clear and easily understood. I'll talk just a little bit about how to join in our movement if your agency or you are interested in that. And then I really want to save some time for questions and answers and opportunity for discussion. So with that, what is U equals U? It's obvious, I think, to most of us anyway. Undetectable equals untransmittable. So people who are living with HIV and who are consistently taking their medication and remaining on their medication and staying engaged in care and achieve an undetectable viral load cannot or do not transmit HIV to their sexual partners. And you notice right up front that I'm saying cannot transmit HIV to their sexual partners, and I'll get into the science of that in a moment. I'm going to play a couple of video clips. I'm hoping that the sound works here. Just talking a little bit about U equals U and explaining a little bit about what U equals U before I go into it further.
Lastly, we need the undetectable is untransmittable or U is U message to become standard knowledge worldwide. It needs to sound louder every day, as this eases the burden of stigma and self-stigma of people living with HIV. It will save lives. It will reduce suicides and murders on trans sex workers especially.
You may have seen in the news just recently, Jonathan Van Ness, one of the Fab Five on Queer Eye, recently came out as HIV positive, and this is a clip from Jimmy Kimmel Live where he explains it and talks about it.
And there's been so many studies, the most recent one, which was by the National Institutes of Health, led by Dr. Anthony Fauci, and it followed like a lot of serodiscordant couples, which means like one's negative, one's positive, for about 10 years. And not one transmission in this study was reported.
If it's undetectable, if you keep it low, then it's not transmittable.
Well, yeah, so undetectable equals untransmittable.
Right.
And that has been backed up by a lot of studies. And basically when you're HIV positive, you can have access to this, well, you get access to this medication and you become undetectable, and then you can really live a gorgeous, normal life, like 50 to 75.
All right. And lastly, Gareth Thomas, who's a rugby player in Wales, had this interview with the chair of the British HIV Association, Chloe Orkin, and it's pretty powerful and talks about the power of U equals U.
The most important thing I can say is that in the UK, people with HIV who are diagnosed early have the same life expectancy as people who don't have it. But our challenge is to make that a healthy life, not just physically, but mentally. What's happened recently is amazing research, which our unit was part of, which is doing research to see if people who are on treatment and the level of their virus is what we call undetectable, so can't be measured, whether they can pass it on when they have sex with their partner without a condom. And what's been shown is that in hundreds of thousands of sex acts, if the virus is undetectable, it cannot be passed on. And that is what we call undetectable equals untransmittable, U equals U. So people can believe and let go of that sense that they are somehow infectious or can harm other people. And sometimes when I tell people U equals U, they cry. And I see people getting well. And I see people having children, young women having babies. And I see people getting their lives back.
That was a Martin Luther King speech. So when you say U equals U, does that also account for maybe friends you're with or parents or close relatives as far as sharing a cup or tending to a wound, or other things that other people in society still would fear if they knew you had HIV?
Absolutely. You cannot pass it on by hugging, kissing, touching, sharing plates, any of those methods that you've talked about. And the reality is the trials have shown 0 transmissions. There is 0 risk of passing it on. And our responsibility as scientists, as doctors, as healthcare professionals is to keep telling the truth, because there are no public health campaigns now from the government saying U equals U, you can't pass it on. There were the campaigns which were necessary in the 80s saying be careful, use condoms, you could die, but there's never been anything since then saying everyone is safe, stand down, there's no risk. And when people are brave and are prepared to speak on camera, it's an enormous help. I cannot tell you what it will mean to people, the fact that you're doing what you're doing. We're all behind you.
Thank you.
Know, because what you've done, what you're doing is important to every person that I see. It will mean something to the people that I look after.
Okay. I just get scared. I just get scared, that's all.
So I think that's real powerful in terms of talking about the stigma that is clearly still very present when you see someone talk about sharing a cup or utensils, those kinds of things. That is still in the public discourse. And so, I think one of the things that U equals U provides is an opportunity to educate just about the basics of HIV, let alone the opportunity to reduce sexual transmission of HIV. So U equals U, back in history, in '96, we learned about treatment. Obviously, with antiretroviral treatment coming on board, that it was going to save our lives. And now today we know that it means that we can't pass on HIV to our sexual partners. One of the things I mentioned earlier was about tailoring messages. And we've seen in Great Britain, we've seen in Canada, they have adapted a campaign focused on U equals U about can't passing it on, or you can't pass on HIV. So that's what I was talking about the opportunities to say this differently. You don't always have to say undetectable equals untransmittable to get the message out. So where did U equals U come from? Just a brief history. You all know about probably back in the 90s when we were working on mother-to-child transmission. We saw the power of antiretroviral treatments, or in that time AZT. Then in 2007, we saw the concept of treatment as prevention introduced. In 2008, you may recall the Swiss statement, which was very bold for the time. The Swiss Dr. Pietro Vernazza said, if you're undetectable, you do not transmit the virus. And I remember hearing this in 2008 and thinking, there is no way that that is true. They are very, very bold for saying that. And what a difference it has made over about 10 years. And so, as I said earlier, in 2016, a group of activists and researchers and AIDS organization came together to work on the U=U campaign. And so that's where we are today. So how do we know that U=U? This is the main 4 studies that are the science behind U=U. You can see there the samples of the studies. They were in male-to-male couples as well as male-female couples. In all cases, we were talking about serodifferent couples. So we're talking about HIV positive and an HIV negative couple together. In all cases, they were studying undetectable status and what effect that had on transmission. You will see that there were 125,000 sex acts without condoms. It's a lot of sex, good for them. And you will also see that there were a few transmissions within these studies, but none of them were linked to the undetectable status partner. So there were 0 transmissions in these 4 studies with over 125,000 sex acts. And you can see also that there were, you can see the study size in terms of each one of those studies and in the samples. So clearly the science has proven that U=U in terms of sexual transmission. Where we do not have definitive evidence regarding transmission is in breastfeeding and needle sharing. There's not conclusive evidence that there are no transmissions among those methods of transmission. However, we do know that there is a lot of evidence that suggests that it greatly reduces risk and that the people who are on treatment obviously benefit from the treatment. And so, despite the fact that we can't say there is 0 risk in breastfeeding and in needle sharing, we can say that it still improves the lives of people that are obviously mothers who are breastfeeding and those who are sharing needles. These are obvious, but why is U=U a game changer? Obviously, it transforms social, sexual, and reproductive lives. And I think this is really, really important and something that I've found in my own life in terms of being HIV positive since 1986 and learning this information and knowing that I will not transmit the virus to my sexual partners has been really a stigma busting opportunity for me. And I know that many, many people who have taken this message on and understood it have claimed that it really transforms their sexual lives in particular, but also just their social surroundings and their reproductive lives. And that has the opportunity to dismantle stigma. It does also, we believe, encourage HIV testing and adds an incentive to start on treatment and care. In other words, if you do test positive, you're going to be okay. You're not going to transmit the virus if you can achieve an undetectable status. And then lastly, we use U=U as a strong argument for eliminating barriers to access, to universal access. We often call it the third U of U=U, universal access to treatment. We believe that as we put out the power of U=U, it encourages uptake of treatment, it keeps people healthy, it also prevents new transmissions, and of course it reduces stigma, all of the things that we're working on in ending the epidemic. So as I said, it greatly improves the lives of people living with HIV, and it does push us towards the end of the epidemic. So why didn't we know about it? There were these great studies, but what we find is that there's often a lack of knowledge about research in general, and in particular, U equals U. There's also obviously a lack of expertise and authority about the aggregate conclusions of this. There is a lot of paternalism related to U equals U. We often find a lot of biases and prejudices. I'm going to talk about that in a little while, because when we communicate U equals U, we often get the roadblocks. Providers will often say, well, I don't.
Right, I know there are a couple of questions that come in into the chat so far. One, someone was asking about some of the materials and so the stuff that Murray's using in his slide deck. So when we're able to talk with him again, I think he's going to talk about how we can access some of the materials. And the other was about other messages or other campaigns around treatment as prevention. And I believe Murray's going to touch on some of the other campaigns that are going on around the country or in different countries around the world. U equals U is a big one, but I know that there are some other campaigns going on. I know that we saw the rugby player from Great Britain talking, and they have a really great campaign there. I think it's Can't Pass It On is their public campaign, or one of their agencies or countries' public campaigns around treatment as prevention. So as we're waiting, if people know of other U equals U or treatment as prevention campaigns going on in their communities or around the country, around the world, if you'd enter those into the chat, that'd be great to share resources.
Hi, everyone. It's Murray. I am having a lot of difficulty with, we lost power here, and having difficulty getting my computer and internet to reconnect. So can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Murray.
Okay, so I'm going to have to continue. We didn't have a contingency on this, Jesse, with you all having my presentation. I'm going to have to continue without the presentation, but I will just move into audio and talk through my presentation, and then we'll open up for questions. I'm sorry, I thought I had everything back up and went back down again, so my apologies there. Is that okay, Jesse?
Yeah, that's fine, Murray. However you want to keep going, that's great.
Okay, and then what I will do is I will send the slides out to everyone, to you to distribute to everybody afterwards once I get back online and everything.
Great.
So where we were, I believe I was in the middle of talking about the U equals U being a game changer for the movement. Where we then went, once we got to the place of knowing that this science was in place, we knew the power that U equals U has, and so we went to the researchers and talked to them about coming together and creating a consensus statement that confirmed U equals U. We sought out pioneering and influential leaders in the field and public health officials to support and endorse the statement. This was back in 2016. And we jump-started talks with HHS because we felt it was very important for the federal government to be communicating this information. The feds, CDC in particular, and HHS started a process to update their definition of risk, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And we created some advocacy videos, and those have been used nonstop since, while at the same time we were reaching out on social media and building our network and showing our force through the growing numbers of people and organizations that were pushing this message out. The city of New York was the first health department to sign on to the consensus statement. Terence Higgins Trust in the UK, Broadway Cares, and NASTAD were some of the first organizations to endorse the U equals U consensus statement. Today, we have about 930 organizations that are signed on to the consensus statement in 99 countries. And the U equals U message has been translated into various languages. Sometimes it translates differently, obviously, than undetectable equals untransmittable. It's I equals I in Spanish. It's K equals K in Vietnamese. And there are varying other translations as well. So it isn't U equals U, particularly across the world. As I mentioned, organizations and different communities have taken that message and adapted it for themselves. And I've already talked about Canada and the UK using Can't Pass It On. But we have seen countries that have signed on to this U equals U movement, in particular Zambia, Australia, some of the other, Vietnam. There are several countries that have signed on and are actually working on campaigns within their country to inform people about this, the power of treatment as prevention and the U equals U movement in particular. As it relates to CDC and the messaging there, CDC's official message is effectively no risk of transmission. Effectively means in actuality. And as we know, there is not necessarily ever a time when you can say there's absolutely nothing that's going to happen. It's absolutely, not going to happen that my house is going to burn down or I'm going to lose power or anything like that. But things do happen. However, in terms of U equals U, we have seen, and we can say with confidence that if someone is undetectable and if they remain on treatment, that they will not pass the virus on to their sexual partners. And so despite the fact that CDC has not said no risk, we believe that effectively no risk conveys the same message. It's not as easily understood, and so we are advocating with CDC and others to move away from effectively no risk and go to zero risk or no risk, just because I think, and I'll get to communications, how we communicate this in a moment, but the use of very strong language instills confidence in something that's important. So CDC came out with the effectively no risk language in about 2 years ago in September of 2017. All the while, we've had a lot of experts, particularly those at the NIH, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Carl Dieffenbach, that have been saying there is zero risk for years. In fact, Dr. Fauci at USCA in September of 2017 said this, and we've seen others continue to say the same thing. CDC also in August of this year, well, actually it was July, updated their risk assessment to say that having an undetectable status is 100% effective in reducing transmissions, eliminating transmissions. And so that's the other thing, that despite the fact that they're still using the effectively no risk language, it is 100% effective, and CDC has said that as well. And come out with a letter, many of you have probably seen that, in August of this year, saying that this treatment as prevention message should be used, and that they encouraged varying degrees of using that message, adaptation of that message, including the U equals U campaign. So CDC is on record of supporting this as well. And that's really important, we know, to many of you who have CDC funding, to be able to make sure that you've got the backing of CDC to use the U equals U message. So I'm going to turn now to, I had a bunch of great examples in the slides related to varying campaigns that you'll have to see when I can get this presentation to you. But I'm going to turn to how to effectively communicate about U equals U. I think it's, as I said earlier, very, very important to make sure that you're bold and decisive in the language that you use. When you convey things like, oh, it virtually reduces the risk, or it reduces risk, or varying other degrees of uncertainty that might be conveyed. Therefore, we prefer and we think it is very important to talk about zero risk, to talk about there is no chance, to talk about it's 100% effective, to talk about you can't pass it on, versus it nearly is possible, or it sort of prevents, or it reduces risk. That is the biggest important factor to the way U equals U is communicated. The other things that I think are important, we know there are arguments, or there are barriers that people often will cite as reasons not to talk about U equals U. Some of those include thinking that U equals U is going to be sort of a guarantee. So it's like, okay, I've achieved undetectable status. Now I don't have to do anything. The important part to remember about U equals U is that it does require regular engagement in care. It requires, obviously, you to get onto treatment, and it requires you to monitor your viral load on a regular basis. We like to use the TLC method of ensuring that U equals U works. T is for treatment, L is for labs, monitoring your labs, and C is for remaining connected in care. So the TLC method will ensure that people remain undetectable. Now, one other important point to note is that the studies look at 200 copies or less. We know that in the US anyway, lab tests sometimes detect above 20 or above 50. In terms of undetectable status and viral suppression, that relates to 200 copies or less. So from a communication standpoint, when people say, well, what is undetectable, or I'm undetectable, I only have 100 copies, it's still synonymous with viral suppression if it's under 200 copies. And that can be kind of confusing because of the varying lab tests that we have in the US. As you look overseas, it's a little bit different. And in developing countries, sometimes there's not even access to viral loads as much. But nonetheless, U equals U applies to 200 copies or less. Another important point in terms of communicating U equals U is that those that do not achieve undetectable status are, still of value. We like to say V does not equal V. So your viral load does not equal your value. And that's because we know that 50% roughly of people in this country are not undetectable. And so, we have a huge population of people living with HIV who obviously would benefit from becoming undetectable, but they're either not on treatment, or they are not able to access it, and or not wanting to access it. And so we have to remember that there's not a value in just achieving undetectable status, that people are valued no matter what their viral load is. And we like to encourage that U equals U provides the opportunity to educate and to motivate people who are not undetectable to becoming undetectable. What about viral blips? We hear that question quite often in terms of what happens if I have a blip. Obviously, if you have one blip that is not too major, if it's still under 200, you're fine. But we have generally seen that blips occur up to 1,000 copies, and assuming that they don't continue over lab tests, then that is perfectly acceptable in terms of viral suppression and does not lead to transmission. That can vary somewhat. That's the importance of remaining connected to care. So remaining in care and monitoring your viral load. So if you do experience blips, you can have additional viral load tests in order to make sure that you're not failing at your treatment. Another challenge we often hear is, well, this will lead to having condomless sex and lead to more STIs. I think the important point to make there is that clearly condoms prevent STIs, and in terms of if a partner, for instance, is HIV positive and maybe has issues with compliance and or adherence, we certainly would encourage the use of condoms. I think the important piece about the messaging related to condoms is that if you choose U=U or PrEP, for that matter, as your HIV prevention method, that does not obviously prevent STIs, and that's where the use of condoms is encouraged. I think the other piece that from a sexual wellness standpoint that U=U provides the opportunity on is that if you are using U=U as your HIV prevention method and or if you are using PrEP as your HIV prevention method, that requires you or should require you to stay in regular care, giving you the opportunity to then use regular screening for STIs as part of your care plan. And again, that's why the importance of staying engaged in care and making sure that you are monitoring your overall health, not just your HIV status. So there's a couple of more points in my presentation that obviously you can't see, that you will see related to some graphics. But I think the last thing I would like to talk just a little bit about is how to get involved in our campaign. We have on our website, and I will send this information to you, it's in the presentation, but U=U.org / community.org. There is a sign-on area where organizations can sign on to the campaign and be connected with others. I think one of the things that really the only thing that we ask is that as a community partner, you agree to convey the U=U message accurately and consistently, and to share the message with clients, et cetera. Right now, we are only accepting organizational sign-ons, but we are working on a process to include individuals in our campaign as well. We ask that you, in your social media, use the U=U hashtag, and that's U equals spelled out U. That helps a very consistent way of staying connected with others who are talking about U=U. And lastly, I think from how to participate in U=U, we do believe that U=U is a powerful message in terms of reducing stigma. And so how it can be used in events and walks and in clinic waiting rooms and in flyers, et cetera, to help convey the fact that the face of the face of HIV and U=U has changed, and that there are so many opportunities now to live a normal and healthy life, just like someone who is HIV negative. And so working to neutralize the status, if you will, status neutral of HIV positive and HIV negative, breaks down that barriers to stigma, et cetera. So I'm going to stop there. I know that this disruption with my presentation is a little bit challenging, but I'm going to stop there and just open up for questions and discussion.
Hey, thanks, Murray, and thanks for hanging in there with us as the challenges go. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and I know we've got some in the chat that we're going to get to. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask questions. So we're going to start really quickly, Murray. I know, so you're going to share your slide deck. There's been some questions about how people can access materials. I think particularly they liked your balloon GIF in your slides. I'm wondering if there's a way to actually get that.
I'm sorry, Jesse, the what?
The balloon GIF that was in one of your early slides, like at the opening, that you had on the side.
Oh, yeah.
It was like the balloons with the U equals U message.
Yes, yes, I can make that available. I don't think we have that on our website, but if you go to uequalsu.org, there's several different areas where you can access materials. There's a resources page, and the other place that I would say is a good place to go. We developed a series of downloadable posters and videos and other materials that you can customize. It's called Positive Series. So if you go to positiveseries.org, I think that's the easiest way to access it. I can't see it because I don't have my computer up, but that's the easiest way to access that. There are a ton of materials associated with that are animated and graphics, et cetera, that you can use as well. We'll absolutely make this all available, but all the resources are on our website, uequalsu.org or preventionaccess.org.
So there's another question coming in from Amy Leonard. It's asking about other ways and messages, the science besides U equals U, any other awareness campaigns. I know we touched on, and you talked a little bit about the Can't Pass It On campaign, but other treatment as prevention campaigns outside of U equals U that you know of?
You bet. So thanks, Amy. There are a lot of different campaigns that have been done. Most of them do incorporate U equals U, but I will say that some of the other ones that we've seen, New York State and New York City, as well as Washington, D.C., have some great campaigns that incorporate U equals U and treatment as prevention, but they're also focusing on status neutral and on sexual health. And so I think that's the other piece where we've seen U equals U incorporated into campaigns that focus on greater sexual health messages versus just the treatment as prevention message.
Great.
I'm not going to speak too soon, but I might have my I might be up and running again and might be able to connect here. So I've been working on that while simultaneously talking. So
I'm going to pause.
Other question?
I'm going to pause for just a second. I know that there's some other questions in the chat, but I want to see if anyone online has any questions that hasn't put them in the chat. Okay, so while we're waiting, so Jamie Shield wrote in the chat, good to hear what you said about the CDC message of effectively no risk moving to no risk. And he asks, are there national or local HIV organizations or professionals who are not supporting U equals U or giving pushback? I remember when PrEP and treatment as prevention first came out, there was some vocal opposition to these messages. Just wondering where work might be needed to bring others along.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of what we're doing is advocacy to really start to move this forward. You know, one of the pieces that I mentioned was the UK campaign in terms of Can't Pass It On. It's amazing to us to watch the entire country and all of the organizations come together and pick that up. We have not seen the same uptake of the U equals U message in the US, and we have seen some organizations really be defiant that they did not want to take this up. One in particular down in the South, not in Texas, said to us, well, we're not going to tell our clients about this because they lie. And so there is a, you know, there's sometimes a very paternalistic sort of, I know what's best for my clients or my patients that we hear. That is extremely frustrating because you know, everyone has a right to the science and the information about their bodies and what happens with their bodies. And so I think where we see the pushback like that, it's oftentimes conversations about what are the real barriers there and what can we do in terms of using U equals U to educate versus just accept the fact that somebody is not going to talk about U equals U. The other thing that we often know is that people will find out, or people are finding out about the message, and then they're, you know, it breaks down trust with clients, et cetera. As it relates to the CDC work, we have had a very, very good relationship with CDC in this regard, and they're completely supportive of the science. I think as we see in many places, you know, I think people are skeptical to adopt a bold 100% no risk, et cetera, because of the life challenges that people have and the you know, the experiences that we see in this country about people not engaging in care and remaining in care. And so I think there's some valid reasons why people would be concerned about the message, but nonetheless, we see that educating and the opportunity to motivate is as important or more important than the message itself, I think. So Jamie, I don't know if there were any more components to that, but you know, there is quite a lot of advocacy, and one of the things that we also ask people to do, especially our partners that have signed on, is to help educate and help push back when they see that you know, an organization is not spreading the treatment as prevention message, however that is tailored for their community. I think it's really important that people living with HIV get the information that, you know, that they deserve. I was at an event not too long ago. As part of that event, the organization was talking a lot about PrEP, focused primarily on PrEP and the importance of getting HIV negative people who are at risk onto PrEP. And, you know, they touted that would end the epidemic. And so I think, you know, as we look at the pillars of the Ending the Epidemic initiative, we see that there's the treatment pillar as well as the prevention pillar. And I think it's important to put those side by side, but the power of U equals U in terms of improving people's lives, in terms of preventing new infections and reducing stigma is so strong that we believe it, you know, needs to be front and center and prioritized as one of the most important ways to help end the epidemic.
Jesse?
Yes.
This is Ann. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, Murray. And I joined late, so if you covered this during your talk, just tell me. And I covered this earlier. What types of messages or what have you experienced from people, reactions to U equals U from people who are not living with HIV, but are part of the community with of people with enhanced risk for HIV?
Sure. So great question, Ann. Good to hear your voice. It's been a long time. I think, you know, where we have seen HIV negative people in particular who are at risk, I think we have seen the power of that. I've got so many testimonials of people, both living with HIV and those not living with HIV, who once they understand the science and the importance of U equals U in their lives and or their partner's lives, I think, you know, we've seen some tremendous freedom from stigma. I think the opportunity that U equals U and treatment as prevention in general has to reduce stigma is seen in lots of areas. Even in those that are obviously on PrEP and understand that the risk is, you know, greatly reduced, 99% reduced in terms of PrEP. I think we have really seen movement there. I think, and the real challenge is that it takes a real understanding and a real opportunity to educate in order to get people to the place where they understand it and understand how it can be incorporated into their lives. So I think that speaks to the importance of the education component that this provides. It's an opening line, if you will, to be able to educate about what HIV looks like today and what it isn't today, which is very different than what it was 20 years ago. Unfortunately, the other piece I would say is people ask these type of questions, and because this is so new, we don't have a lot of data to support what we believe is true, and we are working on some research studies. We're involved in a couple of studies with organizations at the NIH to determine the messaging and the outcomes that it helps in terms of both getting people to an undetectable status, but also reframing their views of HIV in general, and that would be particular to the populations that you're talking about and the HIV negative individuals that might be at risk. But the data isn't there as much as we would like at this point.
So that, Mary, that touches on another question that came in through the chat about U equals U or task or treatment as prevention messages. Is like any data or research is ongoing that it effectively increases engagement in treatment or medication adherence. So I think you touched on that, but if you have anything else to say about that.
Yeah, no, I wish we had more data, and it's, you know, I think it's in process. We have seen some data out of NIH in a couple of studies related to re-engagement in care, and I think the important thing I think here is that and in those studies, at least what we've seen initially, is that to get people re-engaged in care takes a variety of interventions, and it's not just as simple as making medications available. So it's what we know and what we have known for a long time. Things like housing and case management and mental health, et cetera, are all really important factors in not only adherence, but obviously achieving an undetectable status and remaining in care. So I think if we would have had the answers to this, we'd be a lot further along in addressing the epidemic. Clearly one of the most important things that we need to be doing is engaging and or re-engaging people into care and making sure that they get the support that they need to be able to become undetectable.
So again, if you have questions, you can enter them in the chat or unmute yourself, but we'll keep going with questions that have been in the chat so far. Douglas Brown Harvey has asked, he gave some really, for folks who are online and can see, he gave us the Pleasure Project in UK and a link in the chat to that. And he asked for Murray, how does U equals U materials or treatment as prevention integrate motivations for sexual pleasure and desire in campaigning and messaging?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have seen some very provocative, I wish I had my slides up and I'm still not able to get on. Sorry, I thought I was getting there, but still not able to. We've seen some very provocative, if you will, campaigns. There's one in New Zealand that is focused on drop your load and, you know, cum rags and those kinds of things, and talking about sexual pleasure and that it's okay to have sex and to be, you know, to be carefree in terms of transmitting the virus if you're undetectable, et cetera. We also have seen some very provocative campaigns out of Ireland, in Dublin in particular. ACT UP Dublin has had some really very provocative campaigns focused on sex. There's one that many of you may have seen that is basically fuck pause people. And I think it, you know, demonstrates one, I think the extreme sort of side that you see coming at that, and there were a lot of attacks on that, saying, oh, it's too vulgar, it doesn't speak to me. But yet we heard others that were like, oh, this is good because we're pushing the envelope in terms of sexual pleasure and being able to have sex without fear. And so I think, you know, I think clearly we're in a political environment where, and in Texas, I know you all deal with that a lot, having dealt with it, that politically speaking, it's not as easy to talk about sexual pleasure and or sexual wellness. But I think it's an important component of this, and in ways that it can be talked about, I think that is important. So there are some really great campaigns, though, across the world focusing on that. In Vietnam, for instance, the government has taken up K=K. They're not talking about sexual pleasure the way you might talk about it in some other countries. New Zealand and Australia, they seem to be pretty open in terms of their campaigns and what they include with those and what they don't.
So yeah, there's quite a bit of conversation in the chat around those messages, Murray, about connecting sexual pleasure and treatment as prevention in U=U, particularly around youth. I don't know if you, hey, you're on. If you have any, specifically talking about young people and treatment as prevention and messaging and around sexual pleasure, if you have any campaigns or knowledge of people who are focusing the message particularly on youth. You're muted, Murray.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. I hope and pray that this stays on now. Yeah, I think some of the components that I talked about, in particular, those focusing on sexual well-being. The Washington, D.C. campaign, it's focused on sexual well-being, does focus a lot on youth. Clearly, they're talking about far more than U=U and just treatment as prevention. It's focusing on PrEP, it's focusing on birth control. There's a much wider STIs. There's a much wider focus than just on U=U. New York City is the same way. The campaign there is focused in much the same way. So, and I know Houston, for instance, has got some really great stuff in their campaign. But I could detail some more resources, but in particular, it's those that are focusing on sexual health that I think incorporate the youth aspect. I believe that there is a campaign that is focused on Can't Pass It On up in Canada, and they have some youth-specific resources as well.
And I know Douglas has mentioned in San Antonio, and we can find out more about that project. A Unify project in San Antonio as a prevention project has been really effective in reducing transmission.
I'm going to see if I can share my screen again and get this all up and running, Jesse, because I could show a couple of these. I won't go through the whole presentation because I basically covered that, but I could show a couple of these campaigns and you can get an idea of some of them. Let me see if I can get this going here. Really apologize about my technology issue. Just about there. Meanwhile, can we take other questions too while I'm getting this loaded?
So there was a technical question about when the Swiss endorsed treatment as prevention, what the viral load limits were at that time. Was it? It was like 200 copies was sort of the norm then too. This was in 2008, right?
Yeah, it was in 2008. I would have to look. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can look and find out.
What other questions do folks have?
Let's see if I can get this going. I think I may be good here.
So I know, Marie, some of the conversation that you and I have had about treatment as prevention and U equals U about, and you talked a little bit about this, but I don't know if you have more to say about this sort of the bridge between, and Ann Robbins talked about it a little bit, that bridge between reaching, I think U equals U has been really effective and it's messaging for people living with HIV, and particularly those people who are engaged in our systems. That messaging is going out, but how do we effectively get the message, or then the science and the not super complex messaging, but the details of the messaging out into particularly like the HIV negative gay men, to try and decrease some of the discrimination and stigma within the gay community, but then moving beyond that even out into the broader community. How did other countries or programs that are effectively doing some good public or mass awareness campaigns and education and those sorts of efforts, or what your thoughts on what that would take even to do?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a great point. And one of the things that, we look at is our overall communication strategy. So we've clearly got a communication strategy to people living with HIV, but it's far bigger than that. It's to policymakers, it's to providers and those that have an ability to impact people's beliefs, but then it's also the general public and public awareness campaigns that can be done. Clearly the effectiveness of public awareness campaigns is not as big as the opportunity that you would have on an individual one-on-one basis. But where we've seen a lot of our pushback is from providers that are not talking about U equals U, and even PrEP for that matter, with their patients. They're not doing sexual risk histories. They're not talking about sex. And I think one of the things that we generally see is where we see these messages being disseminated broadly is where people are more open about talking about sex. And so as we can relate this back to sexual awareness and provide opportunities to talk about this as one component of sexual wellness, we can start to change beliefs, because I do really think that this is about the long-standing stigma about HIV and how that relates to sex. So there's a lot of work to do. Really, we know that we're not going to get there with just one approach. And so I think some broad awareness campaigns are really important about what HIV is and what it isn't today. I don't know if that completely answered your question, Jesse, but I think it starts to get out.
Yeah, I think it starts to get that. So we had in the chat, Douglas did provide, there were some questions about the Unify campaign in San Antonio. He did provide the link in the chat for people who are interested. And then Jeffrey Parks has asked, is there any reporting requirements or investigational process for any purported U equals U failures?
You know, I think we, as I mentioned, where we were talking about in the studies, where we are talking about transmissions that did occur, they were able in those studies to determine that they were not linked to the undetectable partner. Just like I think we have seen a few reports of, you know, individuals that have seroconverted when they're on PrEP. I think that there are some anecdotal reports that we often hear, but when it comes right down to it, what it appears has happened is people aren't taking their PrEP or people aren't taking their medications. I am not aware of any investigational studies along this line or any reports where we have seen, again, where we have seen any transmissions that were actually linked to somebody who was undetectable. So it's a great question. I haven't seen much research on it though.
Hey, Jenny, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Hey, Murray, so great to see you.
Hi, Jenny.
So thanks. So this is, you know, we were talking about how to get the message to the community and also to providers. And I also see the challenge that we have with providers in the system as a whole, especially in jurisdictions where we still have a large undiagnosed rate of people who have not been yet diagnosed. And we've been struggling. We've been using this message about we can reduce transmission when we identify someone and we get them tested and into care and their viral load decreases, and now we for sure can say with this strong message, and transmission will not occur. Yet here we still are, you know, what, 13 years since the CDC's recommendations on routine screening, and we still aren't making much progress. What kind of, what would you say as another tact we can use or other jurisdictions can use besides going to policymakers, trying to affect change in laws, et cetera, in also using this message?
Yeah, I think this comes back to sort of the, I know exactly what you're talking about, Jenny, and I think, you know, again, if we had this figured out, we'd be a lot further along in terms of addressing the epidemic in this country. I think it's a travesty that we have, you know, only half of people in the country, you know, engaged in care, regularly engaged in care, and undetectable. I mean, with the tools that we have, it's just incredible that we can't make more progress. I do think that, you know, using the U equals U argument as that universal access and breaking down the barriers that are there is really important. I have heard so many stories about people, despite the fact that we've got a great Ryan White system, we've got great agencies, we've got, you know, all these tools, we've got all these systems of care, but people keep hitting challenges in terms of staying in care, getting recertified in ADAP. There's so many things that people complain about and we hear about why they don't stay in care and why they're not testing. You know, we're getting ready to release some results about some studies that we've done relative to the youth population and their awareness of U equals U, and and PrEP, et cetera. And it's amazing how many people do not know about this. And if they do know about it, despite the fact that they know about it, they're still not employing the tools that are at their disposal. So they know about PrEP, they know about U equals U. If they're positive, they're still not engaging in care. So this is the real challenge. And I think, again, that thinking about this in new and different ways, as opposed to just our usual messaging about you have to get into care, you have to stay on treatment. That isn't working. And so thinking outside, in the Ending the Epidemic Initiative, this disruptive innovation, I think it's got to be far more than disruptive. It's got to be like radically different. We just have to think differently and work differently. And I don't, unfortunately, have all the answers to that, but that's what we're towards.
Are you all planning on using, I mean, I always refer to, how we have drastically reduced perinatal transmission, and the first step is to get tested. Are you all going to use that we have this evidence that U equals U when it comes to, similarly to perinatal transmission? We know that U equals U does not completely apply because of breast milk.
Right.
Yet, HPTN, that was the big thing to say, look, if we got to get women tested when they're pregnant, are you all thinking of using that similar strategy to affect policymakers and administrators or the folks that manage or direct the policies within healthcare settings?
Yes, I mean, we're working with CDC and the administration to try to get to a place where that is more foundational. We're clearly not at the place where tying back the importance of U equals U to testing. I mean, I think you're so right. The AZT and the early mother to child transmission successes are all based on knowing what someone's condition is, knowing that they're HIV positive, so that then you can employ all the tools that are necessary. So that's, yes, to answer your question, yes, it's part of our public health argument that we always use related to U equals U.
Thank you.
We have Murray, we have a question from Lisa Mataya in Fort Worth in Tarrant County. They're conducting a U equals U survey with subrecipients and community partners, and she's interested to see if somebody from Prevention Access Campaign would be able to help review the results and provide any additional insight, if you would be interested in partnering with them to look at what they're doing and what comes out of it.
Absolutely, and we can probably connect you with some others who have done similar type surveys. There's a great example out of Minnesota, for instance, that comes to mind, but we can connect you there as well, for sure.
And then Robin has asked, and again, Murray, some of the conversation we've had as well, like how does treatment as prevention or U equals U and disclosure, what is that, like where is the question? How's that being addressed? How are those conversations happening?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I actually, in my confusion with my not having my PowerPoint in front of me, I didn't get to that. But I think criminalization and disclosure is a whole other issue that we could probably spend an entire webinar focused on. There have been a few states that have reformed their criminalization laws and modernized their criminalization laws. I know that North Carolina, for example, now in terms of their disclosure requirements, they now have it being that if you have been undetectable for 6 months, you are not required to disclose your HIV status. So that is, North Carolina is the state that comes to mind in terms of disclosure. That is, believe it or not, one of the more modern states. We've also seen some states that have changed their their criminalization from felony to misdemeanor based on status, et cetera. So clearly the criminalization piece is complicated. I think, none of us would suggest, like the right-wing media has done lately, that we think it's okay to intentionally expose someone to HIV, right? I mean, and there's criminalization laws in particular that are broad that could address that rather than HIV-specific criminal laws. But from a disclosure standpoint, I do think there are reasons why people don't disclose, particularly if it's not safe to do so, if they're, you know, in relationships that that might create violence and or unsafe situations for individuals. We like to say that disclosure is a very personal issue. The U equals U argument, the undetectable status has clearly, in some cases, made it easier to disclose and make it safer to disclose. I think some of you might have seen Designated Survivor. There were a couple of episodes where there was a conversation about disclosure of someone who was undetectable to his partner, and it didn't go so well at first, but then over time it went better. And I'm not trying to liken disclosure of your HIV status to a TV show, but what I will say is that it's a very personal decision, and I think it's one that we should be talking with our clients and patients about, that they need to understand that in many states there are still criminal laws against against exposure to HIV, and people need to know what those laws are, and they also need to be given all of the information about what HIV transmission looks like and what it doesn't look like. And so they have the ability to, when they're disclosing, talk about that with who they are sharing their HIV status with. It's a very complicated topic, and one that I think we could debate back and forth. Some people feel as though disclosure should be absolutely mandatory. There's a lot of people who are living with HIV who are undetectable, who liken it to, I don't tell people that I have a diabetes or something like that when I'm having sex with them, so why would I need to share my HIV status? Very complicated and not something I'm saying I recommend. Personally, I think it's always important to disclose and to share, but that's just my own personal views about it, and one that is not easy for everyone to necessarily do. Not to mention what the shame and stigma around disclosure is to many people, and how difficult it is for them to talk about it. I do think that the health literacy and people's understanding of HIV transmission gets pretty difficult and pretty tricky pretty fast. And so relying on everybody to know that they are really educated and literate in transmission and or anything else related to their health is difficult. We know that health literacy is one of the challenges that we experience in a lot of conditions, but in particular HIV.
So we have just a couple minutes left. If anyone has any last questions.
I'm going to see if I can just share a couple of these slides.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Can you see this? Let me see if it's going to come up here. There we go. Let me go through this real quick and see if I can show you a few of these campaigns in the last couple of minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
They won't lose everything here. Oh, goodness. I'm almost there. Okay, here's some examples of the Great Britain, the UK, all of the various campaigns. Let's see, I gotta share my sound here. All the campaigns focused on Can't Pass It On in particular that are taking place in Great Britain. This is Vietnam, K equals K. That was a K equals K fashion show that the Ministry of Health was involved in Vietnam. This is Zambia. Down on the lower right, that's the president of Zambia signing on to U equals U. But here's some
With you, it goes you, we can, we la la, we nenuka, we la la, keep on fighting.
This is some students in Ireland that have created this. You can see the ACT UP Dublin talk about sexual, provocative sexual messages there on the right. This is from Tokyo, some dance parties that they had. This is Vienna, the Life Ball. There was a lot of public campaigns that you can see down there on the bottom and on the left related to Life Ball in Vienna. Here's the Drop Your Load campaign from New Zealand. These are both New York State and New York City campaigns. New York State on the left, New York City on the right, that we believe are really great campaigns. In New York City, it's Made Equal, and they clearly work, play off of that HIV treatment working. And examples from around the world there. There's a map of our, this is the map I was telling you about, preventionaccess.org/community, showing all of the partners that we have in the across the world. I'm gonna just go real quick to this slide.
Oh, it looks like we've got one more, and it has to come from U=U himself.
Hi, Allison. Today is marking a revolution in what it means to live with HIV. So thank you so much for your research. I have a question on behalf of the U=U campaign. There are many providers that are still not accepting this message. They try to focus on the risk is not zero scientifically, or they focus on their patients aren't going to be adherent and they won't know that they're detectable, or they say there's a rise of STIs already, so they don't want to share this with their patients. We get every single kind of excuse. What would you say to clinicians or any other information provider who is withholding this information from people with HIV?
Yeah, and I just want to pay tribute to the U=U campaign. It's been astonishing. I think the time for excuses are over. I think it's very, very clear that the risk is zero. Okay.
So that was Allison Rogers. She was the lead author on the Partner 2 study and the final study that was just out last year. So I wanted to show that to you as well. And I'm sorry I didn't get to go through this presentation, but those were some examples of some of the campaigns that are being done across the world.
Jeffrey was asking about the T-shirt that Bruce was wearing, I think.
We do have some T-shirts available on our website. If you go to the shop section, we are working on enhancing that so we can make more T-shirts available. We're working on our own store, but right now it takes you to Amazon, and there are some T-shirts available there. But stay tuned on that as well.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to 11:30, so we're out of time. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks Murray for sticking in there with us and the technical problems and being flexible enough to work through it. We will have the recording posted up online. Again, as I said, if you're interested in keeping up with all of the ongoing webinars and things that we're doing across the Texas HIV Syndicate and our Ending the Epidemic Plan, Achieving Together, you can go to achievingtogethertx.org and sign up for the mailing list, and you'll be updated weekly with everything that's going on across Texas around this. I think Murray touched on some interesting points that we're going to keep talking about over the next year. I know, like in the side conversation with Murray and prepping with this, I think the disclosure conversation is something that our communities are engaging in and trying to understand and what that means. And I think that's a really interesting and nuanced conversation for us all to think about and look at over the next year as we go into, hopefully as well next year, we'll be doing the Texas HIV conference the HIV STD conference, and maybe that's some of the content there as well around U equals U and PrEP. I think that this science all of the science that is brought forward and made it possible for us to really talk about ending HIV also makes just the conversations we have with our communities and the people that we serve that much more complicated, how we effectively message that. I think it'll be curious to hear from folks about out in the field who are doing work, particularly around HIV, working around HIV negative folks and doing testing, how you're educating people around treatment as prevention and U equals U campaigns and PrEP, and how all the strategies come together. And I think as Douglas has brought up so much in the chat, and several people have tried in about whole sexual health and sexual pleasure, and how all of that now is the message that we need to be effectively communicating. It's no longer about using a condom every time. It's about how do people have healthy, whole sex lives as complete people. So we'll be engaging those conversations as well through various venues over the next year. But thank you everyone for joining us. Super thank you to Murray for being able to get on with us. And we appreciate all your work. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.